Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Cholet. I'm the Executive Vice President at the German Marshall Fund in the United States, based in Washington, and I'm delighted to be joined today by three colleagues who will offer perspectives in our latest installment of our speaker series, Beyond the Peak, providing updates on the coronavirus response and the way forward from Europe. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Anand Menon, who is the Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London, and will be joining us today from Oxford. Next, we'll have Nicoletta Perozzi, the head of EU and Institutional Relations at IAI, based in Rome, and she is also, we're very proud to have had her as a German Marshall Fund Marshall Memorial Fellow in 2018. And finally, we'll be joined by my colleague in the Berlin office, Sudha David Wilp, who's the Deputy Director of our Berlin office and a Senior Transatlantic Fellow. So what we'd like to do for you today is each of our speakers will present for about 5 minutes or so, give a quick snapshot of what's going on in terms of the coronavirus epidemic response from where they sit, as well as to discuss some of the policy issues that are currently at play, respectively from the UK, Italy, and Germany, but then also in the wider European and transatlantic debate. And after each of our speakers will give brief opening presentations, we will open up the remainder of the discussion for question and answers. And please use the Q&A function on the Zoom system, and we'll be collecting questions throughout the presentations, and then look forward to a good discussion. So we're going to start with Anand in Oxford. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Derek. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm trying to turn my video on, but it says my host has stopped my video, so I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me now?
You're good. Yep.
Good. All right.
Thank you.
I mean, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I'm a political scientist, not an epidemiologist, so my comments will reflect that. In terms of the headlines for the UK, our performance as of 21st of April in terms of the gruesome coronavirus business was, in terms of deaths per million, we were performing relatively poorly, though our rates weren't as bad as France or Italy, though of course there are massive caveats about the compatibility of the data. Every country seems to be counting slightly different things. In this country at the moment, there are two big fights about, one, whether we're massively underestimating the number of deaths occurring in care homes amongst the elderly, and two, whether we shouldn't be counting what we call excess deaths, that's to say deaths that are higher than the monthly average, rather than simply those people who happen to have tested positive. I think the one thing we can be clear about is the official figures are underestimating the death rate quite significantly. In terms of how the UK has handled this, we reacted relatively slowly in the sense that we pursued policies of containment and delay for longer than most countries. It wasn't until the 20th of March that businesses were closed. That being said, there is now strong evidence that the UK is past the peak in terms of numbers in hospital in London, which is the worst hit area. Those numbers are down about 30% since the peak about 2 weeks ago. I should also say there's been a lot of political interest in a claim made by Professor Carl Hennigan, who's director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University, that the peak actually happened on the 4th of April in London because the infection rate was significantly lowered on the back of government advice about washing hands and distancing. And this is politically important because the implication is we didn't need lockdown to keep the rates low. Hennigan is a big fan of the Swedish approach. We can come back to that if you want. The other part of the politics, of course, is the economics. The fallout has been far worse than predicted. The Treasury originally estimated 10% of the private sector workforce would be temporarily laid off. The reality, I suspect, is going to be more than 3 times that number. And for that reason, amongst others, there is a growing sense of jitteriness in the governing Conservative Party. its meeting of MPs, the 1922 committee, was last night. Some are starting to speak out about the economic damage that is being caused. Some former ministers like Theresa Villiers are coming out publicly and saying, we don't want the economic damage to be worse than the damage wrought by the pandemic itself. So there is a debate in the governing party. And I think that nervousness is exacerbated by the fact that the opposition party now have a competent leader, which isn't as self-evident as you may think. And Keir Starmer yesterday gave signs that he is willing to hold the government to account on things like its targets for testing. The government has claimed by the end of the month we'll be testing 100,000 people a day. Currently we're at 18,000, so it's a big ask. Now, the other thing, of course, is what the public think about this. Boris Johnson enjoyed a public approval bounce, I think larger than most comparable countries, and of course he also got another uptick when he was hospitalized. So unlike plateauing like most leaders did when he went to hospital, his numbers went up again, though it's worth saying that approval figures for the government haven't risen since mid-March, and that will be something that people in government are watching very, very carefully. A couple of other sort of broad issues. One, will coronavirus affect the approach of the British government to the transition period with the European Union? So far, rhetorically, not in the least. We've had the bizarre spectacle of a special advisor to the Prime Minister tweeting policy a couple of weeks ago when David Frost said, we're not going to ask for extension to transition, and if the EU asks us, we will say no. There are incentives both ways, whether political incentives to end transition when they've said, economic incentives to extend. I'm happy to talk about that in questions. And finally, there are the macro questions. The pandemic has raised a lot of very big political and economic issues, from the impact of austerity to the efficiency criteria that have been used to govern how the NHS works and has meant it lacks resilience, to who key workers are, how much they're paid, whether they should be treated differently, paid better, given special immigration status. Economic inequality. There's been a row in this country about Richard Branson asking for a bailout. The health secretaries insisted that top-notch soccer stars should be making contributions because they're paid so much. And what we don't know, and what is going to be fascinating and politically crucial going forward, is how those debates play out post-pandemic. That's to say, will there be an impact on our attitudes towards those things that last beyond lockdown, beyond the immediate impact of the pandemic? And I think it's on the answer to those questions that the future of our politics will ultimately hinge. And I'll leave it there if that's okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Anand. That's a terrific report, and I'll definitely want to follow up with you in the Q&A on drilling down a little bit more on what this means for the UK's relations with the EU and the debate about that. Over to you, Nicoletta, from Rome, one of the earliest and hardest hit countries in the world. How do things look from your perspective? Got to unmute, Nicoletta.
Yes, okay. So thank you, Derek. Let me start by saying that during this COVID-19 pandemic, Italy has paid a particularly heavy toll in terms, first of all, of human lives. As you were recalling, at the moment we have more than 25,000 deaths, the first country in the world for that rate, according, of course, to the official data, followed by Spain, France, the UK, and New York City. But we had also a very heavy impact on growth, so on economic terms. If we look at the latest projections of the International Monetary Fund, Italy is the worst performing country with an impact of 9.1% on the annual GDP foreseen for 2020. So really a very dramatic situation. We have been living in complete lockdown since March the 12th. All the productive activities have been stopped. Now these measures are set to remain in place until the 4th of May. And at that time, we will start a phase 2, which could be in place for the next 6 to 8 months, according to the latest news from the government, which is working on this phase 2 together with a panel of experts. This phase 2 will entail a broad lifting of restrictions, but social distancing will still be in place. Everything will be closed, theaters, cinemas, schools will reopen only in September. And plus, everybody is expecting now a second wave of infections in the autumn. So the situation here looks quite dramatic. Which are the some key policy issues which have been dominating the Italian debate in these weeks? First of all, we have to say that this emergency has disproportionately hit the regions in the north of the country. First of all, Lombardy. There we had 69,000 cases and 13,000 deaths. So it was really, really bad, followed by other regions in the north, Emilia-Romagna and Piedmont. So the first question was what went wrong, especially because Lombardy was considered as a model in terms of a healthcare system in Italy. And here there are a number of suspects: mismanagement and non-application of the emergency procedures, which basically transformed the hospitals and the retirement homes for the elderly in centers of the virus outbreak. And this was aggravated by the fact that we lacked ventilators for intensive care and face masks for doctors and nurses. So for the time being, there is a reflection going on the healthcare system as a whole in Italy, and especially two main issues: regionalization of the health system, which gave great autonomy to the governors of the regions, and also the privatization of the health system in many regions of the country. Second element, very important, the impact on the popular support for the European Union institutions. That is also quite heavy in Italy. At the moment, only 30% of Italians seem to have confidence in the European Union, and 67% think that being part of the European Union is a disadvantage. Plus, that was quite shocking. In a poll released last week, it came out that Italians now consider China and Russia as the friendliest country in the world, followed by the US. While Germany, France, followed by the UK, tops the list of Italy's enemies for the majority of Italian citizens. Again, what went wrong? First of all, we experienced a growing sense of insecurity triggered by the pandemic among Italians, which did not find adequate response at the European level, at first in the first phases of the pandemic outbreak. And second, Italy was targeted by massive disinformation campaign, especially coming from Russia and China. We can recall the Kremlin's campaign aimed at making the United States responsible for the crisis, which was quite popular in Italy, and also the China's attempt to discredit the European Union action by countering with the benevolent actions from China. Yeah, this is the situation. Maybe a third final point on what can get even wronger in the country, because as we speak, the European Union leaders are gathering in a highly anticipated virtual summit that is supposed to take crucial decisions on how the European Union will face the huge economic and social consequences of the pandemic. In particular, they will discuss the adoption of a European fund that should help member states facing the extraordinary cost of the current crisis. And as you probably know, in the last few weeks, there were sharp divisions between European countries on how this fund should be financed, and especially on the issue of debt mutualization at the European Union level. So on one side, there are countries like Italy, which considers this as an indispensable emblem for European solidarity. On the other side, we have countries, especially the Netherlands, but also others, that see this as an ultimate excuse for moral hazard by some European countries. So the choice, I think, at this moment is really between the adoption of a real game changer for the European Union integration process as such, or just another fig leaf operation to be used by politicians with their constituencies at national level. So I think this is a very crucial moment. What is at stake is really the resilience of the European Union project. against a fragmentation that we will probably see, and raising also Euroscepticism, especially in some countries, Italy included. So we'll stop here, and I'm available for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. That was terrific. And I hope in the Q&A we can get into a little bit more on this, the expectations for this upcoming virtual summit and the way forward after that. Suda, over to you in Berlin. Germany's been getting a lot of attention here in the United States in the last week because of its early steps in reopening. And also Merkel has, her handling of the crisis has gotten wide acclaim here in the United States. So give us a sense of where things stand from where you sit and how you see things playing out in Germany. In particular, I'd be curious in your take on what Nicoletta just said about the divisions within Europe that this crisis is bringing about.
Yeah, thanks, Derek, and great to be with my fellow panelists, Nicoletta and Anand, and good afternoon and good morning to all the listeners. Exactly, I mean, Germany's at the point where it's sort of testing the waters now for opening up, and there's a real dichotomy in the image of Germany because, as you mentioned, the country has gotten worldwide attention for its resourcefulness and its crisis management in the handling of the pandemic because of the large supply of ICU beds, the massive testing that's been going on about, say, 500,000 per week, I believe, and the use of private and public labs for that testing, as well as, government officials really leaning on scientific experts as they wade into the waters of this pandemic. And that image stands in contrast with what exactly Nicoletta talked about, sort of Germany's image within the EU. I mean, the country did help. It has flown in patients from France and Italy and will probably do more and is putting a lot of money into the ECM. But obviously there is dissension about what sort of what financial solidarity should look like in the face of this pandemic. And then you mentioned the country is at the moment, opening up this week and next week. It's sort of easing back into the new normal. Schools are opening up partially. Certain stores are opening up and places of worship, albeit with restrictions. I believe on Monday, all 16 federal states will mandate the use of face masks on public transportation as well as in stores. So I guess in the short term, you can say, this 2-week window will be crucial because that sort of matches the incubation period, and we'll see if the infection rate, which is I believe below one right now, will it spike again? That's the big question, because if it does, Chancellor Merkel will certainly be ready to revert back into a lockdown. She has been a cautious figure during this whole crisis, and today she addressed the parliament and again warned that we shouldn't open things up too quickly. And she realizes this whole, the whole situation has been sort of an imposition on democracy, but everybody needs to do their own part. And unlike Merkel, she's even shown her frustration. Earlier in the week, she sort of criticized all these sort of discussion orgies on the topic of reopening. I don't know if that made the press and what the translation was like. I'd be curious to know. But you know what? Merkel can do whatever she wants. Her approval rating is at 80% right now in Germany. And also interestingly, in contrast to the other countries, Germany is now shifting towards testing, not just for COVID-19, but testing for antibodies in the population for immunity. I feel like that is also a significant marker on how this country is trying to keep up with the virus. But time will tell if another infection spike occurs. And Merkel even said again today that this is just the beginning. This is going to be a long haul. In addition to what how Germany will be perceived in the EU, I think another thing for us to all watch is how this country that's very sensitive to data privacy, if it does embrace the use of a mobile app for tracing for the virus. That will also be very interesting to see. So I'll end it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Suda, for that. Thank you all for your presentations. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm going to start off with a couple questions for folks, but please use the Q&A to ask a question. Anand, I guess starting with you, if I could get you to talk a little bit more about what you started to talk about on the impact that the crisis is having on the discussions between the UK and the EU on the way forward. You said rhetorically very little has changed, and that there's incentives on both sides of the argument, whether to slow things down or to stay the course. If you could just talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great. And you've got to unmute.
Well spotted. There are ways in which COVID makes the case for extending transition more compelling, and I suppose there are three of them. The first obvious one is, if you wanted a force majeure argument, here it is. No one can doubt that this is serious and there's other stuff going on. Remember, the negotiations have been completely derailed by COVID, not least because the two head negotiators have both had it. And the economic case is one about disruption. Do you really want to put companies through the disruption of Brexit on the 1st of January, in addition to what they've been through because of COVID? Particularly because if you push ahead now, it seems infeasible, to put it politely, that we will agree on a trade deal and get it sorted out by the end of the year. I mean, personally, I've never been that optimistic that the two sides would strike an agreement. It seems to me the red lines are very red and very serious. So I'm not sure they'll reach agreement. But just in terms of adaptation, would companies really welcome the fact of having another massive adaptation on top of the one that's been imposed by COVID so quickly? On the flip side, I think you have politics, and several sorts of politics. One, what is the USP of our Prime Minister? He is the man who, unlike every other politician, does what he says on Brexit. And that's a hard-won reputation, and one he doesn't want to lose. And he's even enshrined in law the fact that we will not extend the transition. Now, a law can be overturned by a different law. He's got a majority, but still, I think symbolically, it will be quite difficult for him to row back from that political gesture. The second thing, I think, is more cynical in a way, which is, if, as most, if not all, serious economists think, leaving the European Union without a trade deal is going to cause significant economic disruption, the disruption already caused by the pandemic gives you some kind of cover. That's to say, it will be virtually impossible to tease out in the early months of next year what is a Brexit effect and what is a COVID effect. So actually, in that sense, you can use COVID as a cover for doing Brexit. And the final thing is an incentive possibly to get Brexit done as far away from the next election as possible, so that any economic damage or uncertainty or churn that is caused by leaving the European Union is safely in the rearview mirror by the time the British people come to vote again. I mean, the one final thing I'll say is, I have never, in my time following British politics, come across a government that worried and spoke so much about re-election so close to the last election. It is the obsession in Downing Street. How do we seek re-election? So those political considerations weigh heavy. Having said all of that, I have no idea whether ultimately they'll do a U-turn and ask for an extension or not. But my sense at the moment is you shouldn't underestimate the potential for them not doing so.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Nicoletta, I'd like to go to you next, and I'm going to cede my opening question. I'll get back to that, but I want to turn to one from Andy Moravchik, who's asked you, going back to this question of the summit coming up. And Andy points out you've portrayed the issue as one of, there's a question of whether this is real centralization of power in Brussels versus another fig leaf for domestic consumption. But he notes that the EU and the European Central Bank has already devoted around 1.5 trillion euros to recovery and macro support, basically without conditionality. So does that not matter? And what concrete steps would you be looking for, do you think the Italian government would be looking for, to take beyond this?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I will specify better what I was meaning in my talk. No, I mean, the steps taken by the European Union institutions were big steps, unconceivable steps until only a few weeks ago. I mean, I was referring to the fact that the actions by the institutions maybe came a bit late, considered the time when the outbreak of the emergency arrived in Italy, which was the first hit country in Europe. But I mean, we have to acknowledge that there were a lot of concrete actions taken by the institution. First of all, by the European Central Bank, with a strong quantitative easing, 750 billion euros. Then this scheme proposed by the European Commission for a European unemployment scheme called the SURE that should be approved today by the EU leaders. And then also the intervention of the European Investment Bank. These were huge interventions to face the crisis at the disposal of member states. However, now we are confronted with another challenge, which is how to ensure that the most hit countries in Europe, and I'm referring particularly to Italy, but also to Spain, France, etc., will have the possibility to have funds at their disposal to face the emergency measures to be taken in the economic field, to face the social consequences of the crisis, to face unemployment, and so on and so forth. For this, but also to save, as I said, the European project in the longer term, and ultimately also the Eurozone, what we are expecting from Italy is a show of solidarity by the other countries. So I'm referring here in particular to the other European leaders, not so much to the EU institutions, which in my view did their job in mobilizing a lot of resources for member states. And this lies with what I was saying before, namely the adoption of a debt mutualization scheme, or if this would not be possible, as this is most probably the result that we will see at today's summit, a fund which will be directly connected to the budget of the European Union, and which will be able to guarantee the debts that the European countries will have to face to do these extraordinary measures for the emergency.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Suda, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what's going on politically inside Germany. I mean, you talked about Merkel's skyrocketing public opinion. It was right before this crisis. The political situation in Germany looked very different and pretty dire, particularly within the CDU. You could talk a little bit more about how you see this affecting the politics in Germany and what this means for the leadership struggle that is still yet to come in the next year or so as we figure out what's going to happen post-Merkel.
No, it's so true. I mean, just a month or two ago, Merkel was considered a lame duck, and she's had a second lease on life, and she's going to be able to really shape her legacy once more. And, you know, she said she's going to step down in 2021. And I think Merkel doesn't really change her mind on things. Once she makes a decision, she sticks with it, similar to the migration crisis in 2015 about keeping the borders open. But the difference will be now, I think she'll have a hand in handpicking, or she'll have a hand in anointing the successor, as she did in the past with AKK, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the current defense minister here in Germany. So she'll be able to help decide who will be her successor, which wasn't the case just 2 months ago after AKK stepped down. Now, kind of related to what Nicoletta is talking about, I think the CDU is quite firm on staying away from the question of debt mutualization. And because of the way politics are in Germany right now, the Grand Coalition is seen very favorably. Both parties have increased their numbers, and you know, the AfD has been sidelined. In fact, a lot of the opposition parties, even the Greens, are you hear from them, but they're not they are not having the surge moment like they did last year. So it would be hard, I think, next year to see a government where the CDU doesn't have the chancellery. And since that's the case, I think it will be very difficult to see the issue of EU bonds come to the fore.
Thank you, Sudha. I'm going to turn to another question from myself, and if I can mention to Zachary, who's running the program, I can't, for some reason, see the questions that are coming. I can only see 2, and I know that there's at least 11 in the queue. So I have a bunch of questions myself, but I don't want our listeners to think I'm somehow just hogging the Q&A. But the question I had for all of you is, and you've all touched in ways on the international response to this and the ways that countries are helping or not helping, or one another, or trying to take advantage, in the case of Russia and China, of this crisis to try to refashion their own image and undermine others. Just be interested to go around, maybe starting with you, Sudha, and then to Nicoletta, and then to Anand, about how this debate is playing out from where you sit. Obviously, there are different needs in different countries. Germany's in a position to perhaps be more of a giver in terms of its support, and the criticism is it's not doing more. Italy's been in great need. The UK, I know, is in great need. The US has been in great need. One of our governors, a local governor here, had to go to South Korea to get testing kits. So just how you see this playing out, the international response. There's been a big debate here in the United States about the WHO, the World Health Organization, and its handling of the crisis. And then as a somewhat selfish add-on question to that question is how the US responds to the crisis, whether it's US international leadership or just the handling of the crisis within the United States, how that is being viewed from where you all sit. So Sudha, why don't I start with you, and then we can go to Nicoletta and then Anand. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Chancellor Merkel has given another boost to this country in terms of its image globally. But I think the country does need to start pivoting. Germany does, and has to start thinking about the EU, and they're certainly doing that. They're looking at flying in even more patients because they've got this ICU bed capacity, and obviously they will be putting the bulk of their financial resources behind any sort of EU recovery program. So I think that is definitely on the table, because this country knows that they don't want to alienate EU partners to the point where there is no euro anymore, because Germany has benefited tremendously with the implementation of the EU in this export-driven country. So this is kind of the situation the country's in. I think it needs to start pivoting and thinking about the EU. The other thing we can also note, yesterday there was news about a clinical trial from a company based in Mainz. I forget the name of the company, but I believe Pfizer is partnering with this company. Now, if this happens, this could also be a way that Germany can ramp up the production of vaccinations if it's deemed safe, and obviously help its citizens, but also EU citizens very quickly. In terms of the image of the United States and Germany, I think that this pandemic has shown Germany's skepticism towards, there's a lot of admiration towards the US for our country's innovation, for its streak of independent mindedness, but there's always a lot of criticism about the lack of a social safety net. And I think this pandemic has shown sort of the weaknesses in the United States. And I think Germans, there have been a lot of macabre headlines about the purchasing of guns. So they see the divided partisanship and the bitterness in the United States, and perhaps sense that there may even be some social unrest in the country moving forward.
Okay.
Nicoletta, over to you. Thank you.
Yes. Well, as I was mentioning in my initial intervention, here in Italy, we had a first phase of the outbreak in which, on one side, we had the European Union institutions basically not responding to the request for support coming from Italy, plus some member states that unilaterally decided to close borders, and in some cases, Germany and France at the beginning decided to stop exports of protective equipment such as masks and so on and so forth. So that was very bad in terms of image of the European Union and other countries in Europe. And on the other side, we had at the same time this big show of of propaganda by China and Russia, which decided to step in, helping Italy with protective equipment. We even had Russian soldiers for the first time on the Italian soil coming to help an hospital in Bergamo, one of the most hit city in the country. So at the beginning, really the general perception was, okay, well, we can trust only countries like China and Russia in this pandemic, what the European Union is doing for us. Fortunately, in the second phase of the emergency, the European Union institutions stepped in. There was a solidarity message by the President of the European Commission. And then Germany and France started to send materials to Italy, medical materials. Plus Germany also took care of some patients coming from the northern region of Italy. And this was largely present in the press and also underlined by the institutions in Italy. However, as I said, there is still an imbalance in terms of perception, and this was due to the massive propaganda, as I said, on one side, and on the other side, if I can say, a lack of strategic communication by the European Union institutions. And at the same time, the debate was also monopolized by the attack by the Eurosceptic / nationalist opposition parties in Italy, primarily Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, two of the major parties, which were attacking the European Union as usual for not being so present and basically monopolized the entire political debate. That's why it was so difficult to provide the Italian citizens with correct information on the crisis and on what, I mean, who was doing what to help us.
Anand.
I mean, when it comes to it's quite hard to talk about the UK and its view of the international because we've become such an appallingly parochial country in so many ways. I mean, you could argue almost that, you know, since David Cameron lost that vote on Syria, we've not really thought about foreign policy in a systematic way in this country. So it's hard, but I mean, a couple of things are striking about this crisis, I suppose. The first is the degree to which the government in the early phases of this crisis was determined not to look as if we were cooperating with the EU. Almost as if, you know, any sign that we were working collaborative with the EU didn't fit the narrative. And remember, the narrative in January was of a massive electoral victory and what the Prime Minister called Independence Day on the 31st of January. And you couldn't, at the same time as stressing all that, say, oh, incidentally, we're collaborating with the EU because that will get us things we can't get by ourselves. So there was a political imperative not to work with the European Union, which has translated itself into this rather weird fight going on here at the moment about whether the government did or did not know about EU joint procurement initiatives and whether or not we should have joined, could have joined, knew about them. The first explanation the government gave was, oh, the EU sent the invitation to an email account we don't use anymore, which was probably the lamest governmental excuse I've heard for a long time. So there is a debate swirling about that. It's very interesting how many people in this country, when you ask them about transition, will say, oh no, but that will mean we have to pay for Italy. So there's a very, very zero-sum attitude towards collaboration. In terms of our view of the United States, it's not, again, something that's been talked about an awful lot here, but there is, you know, in Westminster and Whitehall, there is a sort of concern that one of the building blocks of Brexit was this desire to build stronger relationships and have good trade deals with other countries. It doesn't look like the United States, as it emerges out of this crisis, is going to think of international trade as its #1 priority. Quite the contrary. And that's causing some concerns, because if the rationale of doing this is that we can strike these fantastic trade deals and our partners are no longer so keen because of the impact of this crisis, that could cause a potential problem.
Thanks. And I'm also curious, again, as we're following what's happening here in the United States, and as we are beginning to wrestle with these questions of how to reopen societies and get back to business, it's there's, I don't want to overstate it, but there's been a sense of sort of domestic discontent, and you're seeing these various rallies, you know, and not particularly large, but you're seeing kind of a movement of that we should, you know, open up, and it's, you know, there's been an over response to this. Now, the coming weeks will be critical because, as Sudha mentioned, in Germany's context, as Germany begins to open up, how this impacts the contours of the crisis and the infection rates will matter greatly in the perceptions of whether this was wise or not. And so, of course, we in the United States, we're watching what happens in Germany and Italy and the UK very closely. I'm just curious, though, how, you know, if those kinds of debates are happening, you know, and how they're manifesting, and then also how they're playing into the politics. Here, this is very much in our politics, and it's, you know, tends to be more conservative and Republican politicians or leaders or activist groups that are pushing some of these messages. And you know, Sudha's already talked a little bit about the German political situation, but how this plays into the far right in Germany. So obviously, Nicoletta, you know, with Five Star, and the populists in Italy, how they're affected by this, and then on in the UK, whether it's UKIP or just even within the Labour Party itself with a new leader, you know, how these really tricky policy questions in the near term about reopening and the impact this has on our economies, but then also what it could mean for whether this crisis gets worse or not, how that's playing out politically. So Anand, why don't I start with you, and then Nicoletta, and then Sudha.
I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, there are some voices on the political right that are expressing concern about the economic cost of lockdown. You get some on the libertarian right. You know, you have websites being set up that are saying, you know, why we don't need lockdown and why this is, you know, very much in a sense the tone of the Prime Minister in the early stages of this crisis was, you know, the inalienable not right of the British people to go to the pub. And he was clearly very, very reluctant to strip us of that inalienable right. But of course, what the British people have done is reacted in a completely unexpected way. The evidence suggests that the social scientists who work in this so-called nudge or behavioural science unit near the Prime Minister had expressed caution about a lockdown because they didn't think the British people would buy it. You know, we need to be careful because if we do it too soon, the British people will start to revolt. As it is, we have reacted to lockdown by doing it more than the government wanted us to do. So more of us aren't going to work than the government intended. The government just said, if you can't work from home, go to work. But loads of people who can't go to work, who can't work from home, are just not going to work anyway. As of, I think, the 16th of April, 91% of the British people favoured an extension of lockdown. So the British people have surprised the British government, I think, by supporting this lockdown so solidly. There is absolutely nothing in the way of a protest movement. And in fact, now the concern amongst government is the opposite one, which is, well, we could open schools, but what if no one goes? You know, what if parents are reluctant to send their kids? What if people say, I'm not going to work, I'm not getting on the tube? So actually, you know, the British people have confounded the expectations of our government, I think, by taking to lockdown, by doing it in far more numbers than people expected, and by coping with it relatively fine, which isn't to say there isn't economic hardship. There's going to be massive economic hardship coming out of this in terms of job losses and the like. But there's nothing equivalent to what we see in the United States, even granted it's quite small scale in the United States here. You know, there was one weekend a few weeks ago where there were lots of parties in Manchester, but that wasn't organised politicking, that was drinking. It's a very, very different thing. So it's a whole different range of issues, I think, that this has raised here, but it's not about public discontent with lockdown as yet.
It's very interesting. Nicoletta.
Yes, also, in Italy as well, this debate was quite high in the political agenda. As I said, Italy decided quite quickly to opt for a complete lockdown, following a bit the Chinese model of containment that was used in the case of Wuhan. Of course, this was a choice which was criticized by many in Italy. Paradoxically, the majority of the critics came from the north of Italy, which has been the one, the most affected part of the country, but which is is traditionally also the most productive part of the country in Italy. So there were a lot of representatives of the economic sector advocating for a lifting of the restrictions imposed by the government soon. And these critics were particularly high because we didn't see for many weeks a decrease in the death toll. And so, I mean, on one side, there were no concrete signals that this was working. And on the other side, we were paying a heavy economic cost for the lockdown. And this is a debate still going on. That's why most probably on the 4th of May, there will be a lifting of the restrictions, especially on the side of the economic activity. In terms of how this has impacted on the government, for the time being, I have to say the support for the Prime Minister is still pretty high, but I think this is normal in times of emergency such the one we are living at the moment. However, within the government, we have two political forces. On one side, the Five Star Movement, traditionally populist Eurosceptic party, and on the other side, the Democratic Party, much more Europhile, let's say, which are, which are experiencing really a hard time in getting the government together, keeping the government together to respond both to the opposition and also to have a unified stance in Europe. So I'm not sure the government will survive this test.
And Suda.
Yes. Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think there's no race to reopen here in Germany. We're seeing some regional differences now. Some governors, if you will, or minister presidents, as they call them here, are being a little bit more ambitious than others. And some of them are even also future chancellor candidates. So we'll see how that plays out. But there's definitely no level of protest like there are in the United States. Certainly there's a debate about the trade-offs that are being made. There's naturally sensitivity to the economic distress, as well as mental health issues that are also involved with this lockdown. So people are aware of that. But I think the reason the electorate has been behind the government is because Merkel has been pretty straightforward. She said she realizes this is, curtailing civil liberties, and coming from East Germany herself, people can sympathize with that. She can relate to the situation, but she also, has stressed the public health is a very, important. It's her responsibility to keep people alive in the country. If there is a backlash, it will only be from the right-wing AfD if there is a move to go towards Corona bonds. But again, I don't see that happening anytime soon here in Germany. So hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Suda. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately, but this has been a terrific discussion, and I really appreciate Suda, Nicoletta, and Anand for taking the time to offer your perspectives. Lots of interesting things to discuss. We could go on much longer. The good news, we will return again with another update from Europe in a few weeks. So I want to thank everyone who took the time to join us this morning. Thanks again to our speakers. I want everyone to stay healthy and all the best in the coming weeks. Thank you again and have a great day.
Bye, thanks.